the cold winter of 1947, an event unfolded in rural Kentucky that would become one of the most shocking and tragic in the state's history. Robert Mills, a county health inspector, was sent to a small remote cabin after reports surfaced about child neglect. He arrived at a dilapidated, rundown house far from the nearest town, where the air was thick with the scent of decay. What Mills found inside was far worse than mere neglect. The family living there was not just struggling in poverty, they were enduring a far darker fate, one that had been years in the making. 3 generations of the same family lived under that roof, but it was no ordinary family. There were brothers married to sisters, cousins fathering children with cousins. At the heart of this disturbing situation were 2 sisters, Martha and Sarah Whitlock, whose decisions would leave an indelible mark on their bloodline. In the early 1920s, these sisters, who had grown up in an isolated mining community, made a pact that would become the foundation for a genetic nightmare. A pact that was kept a secret from the outside world, hidden for decades. The sisters, trapped in an environment of extreme isolation and emotional dependence on each other, had become more than just siblings. They were all each other had left. Their parents had died in a mining accident when they were young, leaving them to fend for themselves in a world that offered little to no support. Over time, their relationship grew closer, developing a dependency that was stronger than the bond of mere sisterhood. So close, in fact, that when Martha became engaged to a man named Thomas Hadley in 1923, Sarah became consumed with the fear of abandonment. Sarah, who was still only 17, couldn't bear the thought of being left alone in their small, isolated world. Martha, trying to soothe her sister's fear, made a promise that would alter the course of their lives. She told Sarah that Thomas would not just be her husband, but also hers, that he would be shared. This decision, made out of a desperate attempt to keep the sisters together, set off a tragic chain of events that would span decades and leave the small Kentucky community reeling. The family's story was buried for years, only recently coming to light, with the medical records, birth certificates, and death certificates offering the stark truth that was hidden for so long. When Martha and Sarah became pregnant within months of each other, they knew that their decision would have dire consequences, but they could not have anticipated the catastrophic results. Their agreement to share a husband wasn't just unconventional, it was the start of a biological disaster. Thomas Hadley, their shared husband, wasn't some distant stranger to them. He was, in fact, their distant cousin. Both Martha and Sarah shared common great-grandparents with Thomas, making their children not only half-siblings, but also relatives whose genetic makeup was already deeply intertwined. The effects of such genetic isolation began to show immediately. The first of the children, born in 1924, suffered from severe deformities that even local doctors couldn't explain. As time went on, the births became more frequent and the birth defects more severe. By the time the family had produced their 8th child by 1930, the damage was undeniable. The children of the Hadley-Whitlock union began to show clear signs of physical and mental degeneration. Some were born blind, others with severe mental disabilities, and some with physical deformities that made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to live a normal life. One of the first to suffer was James, the eldest son, who developed severe seizures that baffled the local medical community. His spine began to curve in unnatural ways, and his growth stunted so severely that by the age of 16, he resembled a 10-year-old. His condition was diagnosed as a result of inbreeding, but at the time, there was little understanding of the long-term effects of such isolated genetic lines. Mary, James's half-sister, was born just months after him, and her case was even more alarming. At birth, doctors initially thought she had a cleft palate, but as she grew, it became clear that her entire facial structure was malformed. Her eyes were set too far apart, and her skull was misshapen. Worst of all, Mary was deaf, her face so disfigured that the family kept her hidden from the outside world. It wasn't just Mary and James who suffered. As the family continued to grow, so did the list of children born with serious deformities. The doctors who examined the children of the Hadley family found an overwhelming pattern of genetic disorders. The children were not just physically deformed, they also showed signs of severe cognitive impairment. Some were unable to walk, speak, or even interact with others in any meaningful way. Many of the children died in infancy due to multiple organ failure or other complications related to their damaged genetics. The most heartbreaking of these cases occurred in 1940, when James, the eldest son, somehow fathered a child with his half-sister Mary. The pregnancy nearly killed Mary, and the baby, when it was born, was a grotesque shadow of a human being. It had no fully formed lungs, its organs were misplaced, and its brain was so severely damaged that it never achieved consciousness. The child survived for only 3 months before it passed away, and the coroner, Dr. William Patterson, described the infant as the most genetically compromised human being he had ever encountered in his entire career. The Hadley family had become a living example of what happens when genetic lines are pushed to their limits and beyond. But instead of realizing the grave consequences of their actions, the family continued down this path, convinced that they were part of some divine experiment. Martha and Sarah, the two matriarchs of the family, began to see their suffering not as the result of their own choices, but as a test of faith. They believed that the genetic damage was a punishment from God, a divine challenge that they had to endure. This belief was so deeply ingrained that when the county health inspector Robert Mills arrived at the cabin in 1947, he was not only witnessing a genetic disaster but also a psychological one. As Robert Mills entered the cabin that day in 1947, he was met with a scene unlike anything he had ever seen in his career. The house was overcrowded, with 17 people living in just 4 rooms, yet it wasn't the cramped conditions that would haunt him for years to come. It was the children, the family members who, despite being born of human parents, appeared to be trapped in bodies and minds that didn't resemble anything human anymore. There were children who couldn't walk, who couldn't speak, and some who couldn't even focus their eyes. Some of them looked no older than toddlers, despite being well past the age of 10 or 12. Mills' report would reveal an unthinkable reality. The Hadley family, after all these years of isolation and suffering, was still clinging to the delusion that their genetic practices were part of some greater divine plan. The family had created its own logic, one that explained away the damage they had done to their children as a sign of their chosen status, a test of their faith. They believed that outside interference, be it government or scientific analysis, was simply an attack on their beliefs, a punishment for their devotion. Martha, now in her 60s, had slipped into a mental state that made it nearly impossible for her to comprehend the damage they had inflicted upon themselves and their children. When Mills documented the family's living conditions, he noted that they were horrific. The cabin was filthy and lacked basic amenities like running water or electricity. The rooms were poorly lit, with only dim candles to light their way. Yet what truly disturbed him was the family dynamic. The children, most of whom had never left the confines of the cabin, had created a world of their own. They had developed a language and customs that were completely foreign to normal society. The adults, too, had their own rules that were based on a twisted belief system that had evolved over generations. They had become so isolated, so removed from the world, that they no longer saw their actions as immoral. In their minds, they were carrying out God's will. Mills found that the family believed the reason for their suffering was due to external forces, evil spirits, contamination from the outside world, or even government conspiracies. They saw their genetic abnormalities as a form of punishment or divine test. Martha, when interviewed by Mills, insisted that their troubles had nothing to do with the inbreeding. She told him that the suffering was God's way of testing them, and that outsiders wouldn't understand. Her words, however, lacked the clarity of someone who truly understood the depths of their suffering. Martha's insistence on this delusion only deepened the tragedy of the situation. The children, for their part, had been raised in this isolated environment, with no real interaction with the outside world. They had little understanding of what normal human life looked like, and many had no way of recognizing their own deformities. To them, this was simply life. Some of the children had developed their own unique ways of communicating, using gestures and sounds that no one outside the family could understand. There were no neighbors to tell them otherwise, no teachers to educate them, and no friends to show them what the world outside their home might have looked like. Their world had become a prison, one built on misguided beliefs and a false sense of security. But Robert Mills was not easily swayed. He knew that what he was witnessing was not just a case of child neglect, but a medical nightmare that could not be ignored. He documented the children's conditions in great detail, noting the various deformities, mental impairments, and physical disabilities. He observed that many of the children were suffering from conditions that were unheard of in normal human populations, conditions that had been caused by generations of inbreeding and genetic isolation. One of the most disturbing aspects of the report was the psychological toll the family's situation had taken on its members. Martha and Sarah, in particular, had developed a toxic codependency. They had become so consumed by their shared delusion that they couldn't see the harm they were causing. Despite witnessing the birth defects, the disabilities, and the early deaths of their children, they continued to encourage their surviving children to intermarry, to keep the family bloodline pure. They believed that this was the only way to end their suffering, to heal the damage they had inflicted upon their descendants. They didn't realize that their actions were perpetuating the cycle of genetic destruction. As Mills left the cabin that day, he felt a profound sense of unease. He had seen many things in his career as a health inspector, but nothing like this. The Hadley family was not just an isolated case of child neglect. It was a living example of the dangers of inbreeding and genetic isolation. Mills knew that he had to do something to stop the cycle, but the situation was far more complicated than it appeared. The family's isolation meant that they had little contact with the outside world, and even fewer resources to help them. The locals were afraid to intervene, too scared of the family's violent tendencies and deeply entrenched beliefs. No one had ever dared to step in before, but Robert Mills was determined. He knew that he could not allow this family to continue down the path of genetic destruction. He began to gather evidence, to build a case that would bring the family's situation to light. It was not just a matter of saving the children, it was a matter of preventing further harm. His report would set into motion a series of events that would eventually lead to state intervention, but not before the family's tragedy reached even more devastating heights. In March 1947, just months after Mills' report, state officials arrived at the Hadley cabin to remove the children from their parents' custody. What they found was a family in complete psychological collapse. Martha and Sarah barricaded themselves inside the cabin, armed with shotguns, refusing to let anyone in. They screamed at the authorities, insisting that the government was trying to destroy God's chosen people. The standoff lasted for 3 long days, and during that time, 2 more children died, not from violence, but from the stress and complications caused by their genetic conditions. It was only after this standoff that the full extent of the Hadley family's suffering became known. State social services, armed with Mills' documentation, began the painful task of assessing the surviving children. Medical specialists from the University of Kentucky were called in to evaluate the children's conditions and determine which ones might have a chance at rehabilitation. What they found was a horror show that medical professionals had never seen before. Among the 11 children still alive when the state intervention occurred, only 3 were deemed capable of surviving outside the family environment. The others suffered from severe genetic disorders, mental impairments, and physical disabilities. Some of them couldn't speak, walk, or perform basic human functions. One child, believed to be about 12 years old, had the mental capacity of an infant and the physical development of a much younger child. It was clear that the damage to this family's genetic makeup was irreversible. As the intervention progressed, the full scope of the Hadley family's horrific circumstances came to light. The remaining children, many of whom had never seen the outside world, were taken into state custody. The medical experts who examined them could hardly believe their eyes. The severity of the genetic damage caused by years of inbreeding was unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. These children, who had grown up isolated in a small cabin in the Kentucky hills, were now being exposed to the harsh reality of what had happened to them. Among the surviving children, the ones deemed capable of rehabilitation faced a lifetime of challenges. They had physical and mental impairments that would require constant care. The remaining 8 children, who had suffered the most severe genetic damage, were deemed too compromised to survive without intensive support. For many of them, their future was bleak. The psychological and physical toll of living in isolation, combined with the decades of genetic degeneration, left them unable to adapt to life outside the cabin. The aftermath of the state's intervention was a bittersweet one. Some of the children were placed in foster homes and given a chance at a life outside the family compound. Rebecca, one of the 3 children who survived and showed some potential for rehabilitation, was placed in foster care. Despite the challenges she faced, including the physical deformities she had been born with, Rebecca was able to receive medical treatment and eventually learned to read and write. She lived until 1983, but her life was marked by a deep fear that she might pass on the genetic damage she carried. She never married, never had children, and spent the rest of her life haunted by the legacy of her family's decisions. While Rebecca's life was an example of the small victories that could come from the intervention, the story of the Hadley family was far from over. The records of the family's genetic disaster became invaluable to the medical community. They were used as teaching tools in universities across the country, educating medical students about the dangers of inbreeding and the devastating effects it can have on human health. The case became a landmark in the study of genetics, particularly in isolated communities, and contributed to the early research in genetic counseling and the identification of at-risk populations. But the most disturbing aspect of the Hadley family's story is what was found hidden among Martha's belongings after the state intervention. In her personal papers, investigators discovered detailed charts and records that showed the family's ongoing plans to continue their genetic experiment. Martha had kept track of which children should marry and which cousins should pair up in order to produce the purest possible offspring. She had been planning for the future, for generations of children who were never born, and yet she was still convinced that her family's suffering was part of some divine mission. The revelation that the family had been actively planning future generations of inbreeding made the entire tragedy even more horrifying. Martha, in her mental decline, had continued to believe that the genetic damage was the result of external forces, not their own actions. She saw their suffering as a test of their faith, a challenge from God, rather than the consequence of years of misguided and destructive decisions. It was this delusion that had kept the family locked in a cycle of suffering, preventing them from seeing the true cause of their pain. Martha and Sarah were eventually committed to a state mental hospital, where they spent their remaining years insisting that their children's problems were caused by everything except their own decisions. Their delusions continued, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Thomas Hadley, the man at the center of this tragic story, died in 1945 from liver failure, never fully understanding the devastating impact his actions had on his family. By the time state intervention came, the damage had already been done, and the family's bloodline was irrevocably tainted. The story of the Hadley family left a deep scar on the Kentucky community. The cabin where they had lived, once a symbol of isolation and despair, was eventually reclaimed by the wilderness. The foundation stones still remain, half buried in the overgrowth, and the remnants of old bottles and rusted farming tools can still be found scattered around the woods. But no one dares to build there, no one camps in the area, and most locals, even to this day, refuse to speak of the tragedy that unfolded in that cabin. What happened to the Hadley family serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers of isolation and the destructive power of misguided belief systems. It reveals the dark side of human nature, the lengths to which people will go to preserve their way of life, even when it means sacrificing their own children. It also highlights the consequences of ignorance, fear, and an unwillingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. While some may look at the Hadley family's story and see a cautionary tale about the dangers of inbreeding, the true horror lies in what their tragedy reveals about human nature itself. Martha and Sarah Whitlock, though not evil women, were consumed by fear and desperation. They made their decisions out of a deep need to hold on to the only family structure they had ever known. They believed they were protecting their children, but in reality, they were dooming them to lives of suffering. Today, the Hadley family's legacy lives on in the medical records and genetic studies that were born from their tragedy. Their story is now a part of history, studied by researchers and doctors who strive to understand the impact of genetic isolation. But for those who lived through it, the pain and horror will never fade. The Hadley family serves as a stark reminder that love, when twisted by fear and ignorance, can become one of the most destructive forces in human history. The conclusion of the Hadley family's story comes not in the form of a resolution, but rather in the lingering effects of their tragedy. After the state intervention in 1947, the surviving members of the family were relocated to different counties, and in some cases, given new identities to help them escape the shadow of their bloodline. Despite the attempts to provide a fresh start for the children who had survived, the damage inflicted upon them, both physically and mentally, was irreparable. Rebecca, the last of the Hadley children to survive, lived a life marked by solitude and fear. She was haunted by the knowledge that the genetic curse of her family ran through her veins. Even as she received medical treatment and learned to read and write, she could never escape the fear that she might unknowingly pass on the damage she had inherited. Rebecca's fear of becoming a mother was not unfounded. She had seen firsthand the horrors that inbreeding had created in her family. She never married, never had children, and remained in the shadow of her family's legacy until her death in 1983. Her life, though one of relative peace compared to her siblings, was marked by the constant weight of guilt and fear that she carried from the knowledge of what had been done to her bloodline. The Hadley family's story left a scar that spread far beyond the confines of their isolated cabin. It raised questions about the ethics of genetic manipulation, the dangers of extreme isolation, and the consequences of ignoring the laws of nature. Genetic studies and research into inbreeding became more focused after the tragic tale of the Hadley family came to light. Medical professionals and researchers referenced their case as one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding depression, using it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating genetic traits in isolated populations. But the true horror of the Hadley family's legacy is the fact that they were not an isolated case. While their story was one of the most extreme, there have been other instances of families living in isolation, of generations of inbreeding, and of genetic destruction being passed down through the bloodlines. The Hadley family's tragedy is a chilling reminder that the pursuit of purity, whether it be in genetics or ideology, can have devastating consequences. As the years passed, the Hadley cabin fell deeper into disrepair. The once remote location became overgrown with weeds and trees, and the foundation stones that still lie hidden beneath the underbrush became a ghostly reminder of what had once been. The local residents, who had known the family, continued to avoid speaking of them. The story of the Whitlock sisters and their genetic experiment was too much for anyone to truly process. It was a story that no one wanted to revisit, and yet it haunted everyone who had been involved. Even the medical professionals who had examined the children, some of whom had never practiced medicine again, could not fully shake the images of what they had witnessed. Robert Mills, the county health inspector who first uncovered the family's nightmare, lived the rest of his life haunted by the memories of what he had discovered in that cabin. The faces of the children, deformed and suffering, stayed with him long after he left Kentucky. He eventually sought psychiatric treatment for the trauma he had experienced and spent the rest of his life trying to forget the horrors that he had witnessed. The weight of his knowledge, the burden of knowing that he had seen something so profoundly wrong, became too much for him to bear. His report, once a carefully documented account of what had happened to the Hadley family, had been buried for years. But in the end, it became a beacon of warning for future generations. The Hadley family's genetic experiment, though horrifying, serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of ignoring the fundamental laws of biology and morality. It is a story that speaks to the dangers of isolation, of clinging to outdated beliefs, and of the lengths to which people will go to preserve their way of life, even when it means sacrificing the well-being of their own children. It is also a reminder of how difficult it can be to break free from the chains of the past, especially when those chains are forged by ignorance and fear. And so, the legacy of the Hadley family lives on, not just in the medical records and genetic studies, but in the silent whispers of the community that once knew them. Their story is a warning, one that may never be forgotten, even as time moves forward. Some secrets are too dark to forget, too terrifying to remember. The Hadley family's bloodline, once a proud name in the hills of Kentucky, has become a symbol of the dangers of inbreeding and the destructive power of fear and ignorance. Today, the family's story remains an uncomfortable chapter in the history of Kentucky. The site of their cabin, now reclaimed by nature, stands as a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences of misguided choices. The Hadley family's tale is one of horror, but it is also a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of the darkest of fates. The survivors, though scarred by the past, have become living reminders of the lessons that must be learned from their family's tragic history. And perhaps, in their quiet existence, they will find peace, knowing that the cycle has finally been broken. Somewhere in the woods, beneath the overgrown foliage and the crumbling foundation of that once isolated cabin, the echoes of the Hadley family's story linger. Their lives, though full of suffering, offer one final lesson: the cost of ignorance is a price no one should ever have to pay.